I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
And today we are back with our season in review player profiles. We continue today after doing Jaden Hardy with McKinley Wright the fourth and AJ Lawson. Just going to be looking at their strengths and weaknesses. Going to be looking at what we thought they improved upon from last year to this year, whether that meant that they were in the NBA last year, or they were not, or they were playing college or somewhere else. Is not conducive to any of this. We're just looking at their improvement as a player, regardless of if they were in the NBA before this or not. Then we're going to look at like what we think they can improve upon next year. We're going to come away with one interesting stat for each player. Me and Jaren, since it was two players on this one, we both found a dig on each of these guys. And we're also going to be grading these guys' sustainability in terms of their future in the Mavericks. You know, these are both two-way guys. So you kind of look at that how you want from an aspect of, you know, just their sustainability in terms of being in the NBA. But we'll be, you know, grading in upon the Mavericks. These are both two guys that we thought impressed despite the end of season slope, even amidst, you know, a lot of garbage time and some sort of minutes that can kind of be cast off as an albatross. When their name was called upon to play actual roles in games, more often than not, they were serviceable. So we'll be getting into them. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren. So getting back into it, let's just go ahead and start right off the bat with McKinley Wright the fourth here. What do you think were some of his biggest strengths that he showcased on the Mavericks this year? If you don't mind just like reading off some of his counting stats, I don't have them pulled up at the moment, but I think you might, and just kind of talking about, you know, how he kind of stepped up into a role that maybe wasn't even necessarily there at the beginning of the season. He almost kind of forged for himself amidst some certain injuries that Mavericks were dealing with, and just some, you know, sort of chaos at the guard spot with the whole third ball handler situation that the team did not foresee happening, and of course the Kyrie trade and everything. How is he able to kind of fill in and provide a sort of stopgap measure when the going got really rough and the Mavericks had no sort of tertiary creation?
Yeah, so I mean, McKinley Wright coming into the season, you know, I kind of expected him to be a typical two-way guy, you know, not seeing the floor much, not really having a role. And he did the exact opposite. I think that there was moments in this season where McKinley Wright not only had a role, but he had a pretty important role. I know that that's to the flaws of the Mavericks, but even still, for a player to have that kind of role when, you know, going into the season, we didn't expect to see him more than probably 10 games. It's pretty important for his sort of game. I guess, you know, I'll name off some counting stats, just some, you know, baseline level stats. He averaged 4.2 points. You know, not even a steal or a block for more of a defensive minded guy. He did have 2 assists. He shot from the 3-point line. He shot 32% from the 3-point line. I feel like that number was probably increased over the last, you know, handful of weeks in the season. Cause I don't know about you, Will, but I felt like he started making a little bit more of his 3-point attempts as the season kind of progressed and as he found his shot a little bit more. But from the field, he shot 47%, and he he played 27 games this season. So a pretty good serving size in terms of, you know, what we expected to see. So I guess, you know, one thing that this player did, or I guess one thing that McKinley Wright did really good was fill into a role that, you know, I think even himself probably didn't expect to have. Being that third ball handler, being honestly one of the main defenders off the bench at some points in the season, whenever, you know, guys like Dorian and Maxey were out, he had to, you know, fill in some big shoes, and that's exactly what he did. You know, he's a smaller kind of guy, so there's really not much you can expect, and that's why on the stat book, I don't think his defensive stats are, you know, eye-popping by any means, or at least, you know, the steal and block numbers aren't eye-popping. But he went in there, he provided as best as he could. You know, I think one-on-one defensively, it was a little skeptical at times, even though he is more of a defensive kind of guy. He is smaller in the sense, so he was kind of lost, whether it was with the bigger guards, or if he got switched onto somebody, they were able to take advantage of that, of the height disadvantage. So I think from that perspective, it doesn't really do him justice. But on a team perspective, defensively, I think that he did really, really well. I think I of course, I didn't really watch any. I think he only played one game in Minnesota the year prior, which I guess would have been his rookie year. So I don't really know what all we're working off of or what all he improved upon. But I can tell you that, at the NBA level, he has made some big leaps. Now, is this going to warrant him a role going down the line? I know we'll get into it a little bit later. There's still some questions there to be answered. But, even still, and the role that we expected this guy to have, he definitely filled that in and much more. Played 27 games on a two-way contract. So I think that this guy warrants, a little bit of praise for the season. He definitely, I wouldn't say saved anything, but he played really well for what kind of role he was given.
No, I would definitely agree with you about all the talking points you talked about in terms of some of the things he did well this season. And I would also want to highlight just his dribble drive game, his floaters, and his ability to sort of just manipulate the defense in a half court setting. He honestly impressed me with some of that, just his finishing ability and his ability to push the pace in transition. Because as a smaller guard that struggles shooting you basically have to be an elite finisher and just really good at, manipulating the inside game within, 10 to 15 feet. And I thought he did a really good job of that. He always kind of used actions that like the nail to his advantage. He definitely had a lot, and he has a lot in his toolbox as a smaller guard, and that's definitely very impressive, given his stature in the NBA. In terms of his weaknesses, what exactly prevented McKinley Wright from having an increased role in this Mavericks team? Because we did talk about how he played 27 games, and at the beginning of the season, that would have honestly been a far-fetched. Like he probably exceeded our expectations in that regard because of him being a two-way guy, smaller, all that sort of stuff. But we saw the Mavericks sort of defer to him when Luka was injured, or there was just a sort of profound injury at that ball handler position. But as soon as he would sort of plant his foot in the rotation, and like when an injury occurred or something like that, or he was just able to accrue a few minutes off the bench, it seemed like soon thereafter he would be relegated to another 2-week-long G League assignment, or he would be playing just predominantly garbage time minutes. What do you think is the causation of just the inconsistency in regards to his minutes and him playing more, given that we did see some flashes that looked fairly promising, both offensively and defensively?
Yeah, I think, I hate to bring this point up, but he is a smaller guy. He is a really small guard. I believe he's 5'10" or 5'11", and he doesn't have intangibles. I think it's Ja'Cory McLaughlin on the Minnesota Timberwolves. They're similar in height, but at least McLaughlin has a insanely, probably like a 45-inch vert. I'm not quite sure, so don't quote me on that. But he doesn't have those sort of intangibles. He's very.
I think he's pretty athletic, but
no, I'm not saying he's not athletic. I'm just saying he doesn't have those uber athletic intangibles to make, just an insane defensive presence. Like he's not that. His defense, I think, is derived more from effort. He's a very hard-nosed kind of guy. He's going to stick his nose in places and, try and pry the ball out, or at least try and, make it a little annoying on the offensive player. And that's exactly what he did. Being a smaller guy, he can sort of fit into places, and he can sort of fill in gaps that other players can't. And that's why, from a team defensive perspective, I think he did a really good job. I think, just as a whole, some of his limitations were, not to pry on the side or pry on his size or anything like that, but offensively, he, his lack of shot making, and we even, pretty much told this at the beginning of the season, his shot making outside of, really that floater and finishing point, which you brought up, there really is little to none, shooting 32% on threes. And I think he only shot a total of 17 threes or 18 threes, somewhere around that range. So a really small dosage of 3-point shots, and only to, knock down 30% of those. He's got to get that up. I think, especially towards the end of the season, I pointed this out earlier. He started to drain a little bit more. And I think that boosted his numbers up probably from like the 28 or 25 range, probably up to that 32 range. So I think that those numbers are a little deceiving. I'm intrigued to look at his true shooting stats. I don't have those pulled up right now, but I would be, I would be amazed if they're over, 40, 50%, because I really don't think he's that kind of guy. His shot just limits him so much on the offensive side. Now, on the flip side of things, whenever you're looking at offense, there's his ability to drive and use that first step. He was able to, not snake the pick and roll, but he was able to get in areas where, other guys couldn't, because he's small enough to do so. And his finishing ability, that was, otherworldly, because he was able to do that. As you pointed out earlier, as a smaller guy, you have to have some sort of offensive resemblance to even be in the league in the first place. And his is definitely, going to the rim and finishing pretty much everything. So I think that was definitely a plus on the offensive side of things. So, his limitations definitely derive from size and lack of, in my terms, lack of athleticism, just like from a verticality standpoint. But, even still, he picked up a really big role for what kind of role we thought he was given. And I know that we bring this up probably 5 times now, but still, for what he was, or at least what we thought he was going to be, he definitely excelled those expectations. And definitely, I feel like it was like post Facu, and then Kimba was dealing with like these the knee injuries. He definitely had a bigger role. And I think Luka went down with an injury at that point. And I think it was in Golden State. He really picked it up, and he was one of the first guys off the bench in that game. And I know that we didn't win the game, but even still, there was opportunities in that game that were honestly just all effort based, that he was a part of. So I think, a really good player. Does he have a role in this league? You can argue that. I'm not sure, but I think he's from a natural perspective, he's a good basketball player. It definitely surprised me, I would say. So I was intrigued with what I saw, but is it enough to bring him back? I think we're going to answer that a little later. So
Yeah, no, I mean, especially just given the whole sort of size limitation thing that you brought up, that also just limits his ability to get to the paint in the first place, because, we did talk a lot about his sort of just sort of gaudy finishing for a guy his size, and how he's able to, get around the trees and things like that. But I mean, getting to the rim in those instances is half the battle. And, NBA defenders with their length and foot speed, oftentimes can, throw whatever, offensive speed with the ball that he harnesses. They can kind of throw that by the wayside, just because they can just beat him to the spot with length, or they can sort of overcompensate even if they beat him off the dribble. So that's obviously, part of his limitations in that regard. And the shooting is definitely going to need to improve, especially as his career progresses. I believe he's like 24, and that it, especially with those smaller guards, their foot speed and speed with the ball will, slowly wane once they get on the wrong side of maybe like 28, 29. And that if he wants to stay in the NBA, that's going to be paramount. But just, getting to be that, seasoned of a player, to that sort of status, to actually be a veteran in this league and be a reliable playmaker and shot creator and point of attack defender in the NBA. His pathway to that has definitely got to be by improving his shot and, continually harnessing, all of his defensive abilities as he's currently doing, into playing smart and savvy on that end. And probably on offense, one maybe nitpick I could say about him, he does, like we talked about, do a really good job of manipulating the pick and roll and being able to, find the nooks and crannies in the defense and, get himself open for, those push shots or those little mid-range floaters. But, he's got to open up his bag a little bit more, just be a little bit more dynamic, probably within the mid-range, be able to create for himself a little bit better. and honestly probably create for others a little bit better. He's good. I thought he was a pretty good ball handler and playmaker in the pick and roll itself. But there were some other actions that I thought the Mavericks ran, where you could see maybe his size limit him sometimes in terms of his playmaking abilities, just from his ability to like see the floor and really read out the defense. So if he can just kind of take a step back and survey things a little bit better, I think that could definitely do justice for him and just be a little bit more anticipatory in terms of where the next pass is going to be. I just think maybe improving his intangibles from a playmaking perspective is definitely going to help his case in terms of progressing his career going forward. But I think that kind of just wraps it up for strengths and weaknesses, at least. I know we'll kind of just gloss over this because I know we said that we didn't really watch him too much in his year with Minnesota right before this. We obviously know he was a Pac-12 defensive player of the year, I believe, at Colorado. And he didn't play too much his rookie year in the NBA, but I know that he did improve his shooting marginally, because I do recall us, having watched a couple highlights and, looking at some of his, stat sheets and what have you from some of his games in Minnesota, that he was shooting like in the high 20s or mid 20s. Now, granted, that was an extremely small sample size, but, I think he really just improved marginally as an NBA player, offensively more so than anything, just around the edges, just touched up, refined his playmaking and shooting abilities. But he's going to have to continue to do that, because that is his gateway to staying in the league. From a defensive perspective, obviously, if he gets an unfavorable switch, then a lot of players are going to be able to take advantage of him because of his size. But in tandem with that, he also is a really good point of attack defender. Has a kind of underrated wingspan for a guy's size. I believe it's kind of significantly taller than his actual height, which is always really good for a guy that's under 6 feet. And he can apply pressure. He's really fast on that end, and he'll stick with a guy. But his problems can definitely arise when guys can sort of lull their way into the lane, because they just are their footwork at their size just is able to kind of sort of transcend whatever pressure he can apply because of just how limited he is lengthwise. So if he can continue to do that, just I think in every sort of scheme, he's going to have to guard the opposing team's smallest player, regardless what kind of role that guy plays. And, if he can continue to do that successfully, and, there's not too much of a marginal height difference on the other team with whoever that guy is. And he has the ability to apply pressure on the perimeter and, sort of limit the abilities of another playmaker, and then also be a serviceable, offensive threat. That's going to be, the gateway to him being a capable player for the Mavericks off the bench, or any other team in the NBA, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, quite literally everything you said, I think, is pretty much like what's entailed. I think one thing that offensively he could improve upon is definitely his just shot making in total. I believe 28% of the total shots he took were 3-point attempts. I think that number, especially for a smaller guy, I think if he wants to have more of a serviceable role, which is probably the height of his career, I think that he needs to improve that shot attempts and shot making. He only shot 32% from the three, of course, as I pointed out earlier, but that number needs to go up a little bit. A smaller guard, eventually you're going to get figured out, whether he does have a role on a team someday, and he is in a playoff series or whatever it is, he's going to get figured out pretty easily with his, just how not one-dimensional he is, but in his offensive game is only, he has a good floater game and he has a good drive game. That's pretty much about it. And, he's pretty good at facilitating, but just from a scoring perspective, those are it. So I think if he wants to improve his versatility, on that end, he definitely needs to improve his shot making, outside shot making for sure. And I know he's a smaller guy, he's going to have a bunch of taller defenders and bigger defenders on him. But even still, we see a lot of these smaller guards, their only reliable source of offense is shooting, or at least, the driving kick game. But, I think that's something that needs to improve upon with his game. And I think honestly probably needs to with very soon, because he is a second-year guy and he's 24 years old. So I think it's something over the offseason that he needs to address, and everything that you said he should address at pretty much ad nauseum. So I would tend to agree that pretty much everything we said, I think, probably covers him. So
Yeah, no, I agree as well. But, just in terms of his shot making, I do think one thing that's good about this, at least, is that he has figured out the hard part of the equation, or at least maybe he's been blessed with, just the his speed with the ball and his, how fast he is. But, typically we see the reverse in most of these instances. It's, the smaller guy that has got as far as he could because he can shoot as good as he can. But, he simply is just not athletic enough to be able to blow by guys and, finish whatsoever because, his size limits him. McKinley Wright is also definitely more of a built guy. He's not a skinny, frail 5'11". He's very comparable to, Jordan McLaughlin in that sense. Just a guy that you can definitely tell hits the weight room for his size. McKinley Wright does go in there and crash on the offensive glass sometimes. So from that perspective, I do think that the athletic part of the equation is definitely the harder part when we're talking about guys of this stature. So if he can just open up his repertoire to being able to shoot, that's going to be integral to, his role in the NBA going forward. And, I think you kind of alluded to the one surprising stat there when you said just how little that, of his attempts at his size are 3-point attempts, 71%. You definitely want to get that down. He's just got to become a better spot up shooter in general too, especially if he's going to play with Luka or Kyrie at all. Not all of his attempts are going to come off the dribble. So those are all things to take into account for sure. But before we move on to AJ Lawson, we have to highlight the sustainability aspect of this, of course. Out of 10, what would you give McKinley Wright's sustainability? Taking in all the factors that we sort of classified sustainability as in yesterday's podcast.
I would tally it as like a 4. And some may think that's a little high, some may think that's a little low. I'm sticking with a 4 just because I think, he does have offensive, or he does have and he does have, aspects of his game that, you can produce on a court, and he can have a decent role on a team. And, I think that it's not a 0 because, again, he did fill in a big role and he did excel expectations in that sense. So I think from that perspective, he can probably find himself either on another 2-way contract or in the G League next year, and he could definitely get a call up at any point, whether there's injuries or, maybe there's another, I don't think so, but maybe there's another COVID go around and he finds himself on a Mavericks, or not a Mavericks roster, but just any roster in general. So I think, from that perspective, he's not a sustainable NBA player in the sense that, he's going to get a multi-year contract, but I think, he can be on another 2-way, or he can be in a G League and definitely get a call up. So I think from that perspective, he's sustainable. But as I said, I just don't think he has a role on, maybe on like the Rockets or something. But I don't think he has a role on sort of any playoff roster for that sense.
So, like, when you say a role, do you mean, you're talking in regards to like being a guy that can contribute in the playoffs?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. Because in terms of the regular season, there were points that he did have a role for this Mavericks team last year. But is he going to be relegated to, that sort of 10 to 15, just kind of reserve range where, he's just assurance basically, or is he going to actually, crack a rotation? That's the question going forward. So, just lastly, I guess we'll just ask it after each of the 2-way guys. We'll just do this question specifically, of course. What do you expect out of McKinley Wright going forward in terms of his future in Dallas? Do you think it's going to be dependent on how he plays in the summer league? Will he be back with the Mavericks this summer league? Is his future in the NBA and with the Mavericks basically conducive to kind of really how he plays over the next like 12 to 16 months?
I think, his offensive his offseason progression is going to be really key in, where he's going to be. I think he'll definitely find himself in a Mavericks uniform, at least in the summer, at least in summer league, and probably on an Exhibit 10 contract at the very minimum. I think, there is a world where he
No, I
does.
don't know if he can get an Exhibit 10 contract.
Is
I mean, I
it
don't know for sure just because he's already been on a two-way and
okay? All right. Yeah,
yeah.
I didn't know that existed,
I
but
don't know the exact ramifications of that, but I just wanted to highlight that because I know at least with the Mavericks, I'm just a little weary of that because they've already signed him, of course. So
yeah. All right. Well, I actually didn't know that. So I think that there, is a world where he can be signed to another contract. Um, but again, I think it all depends on his offseason progression. Maybe how depends on how he does in the summer league, because I think assuming he's going to be in Dallas, he'll probably be a summer league starter. So I think it's all dependent on that. But you know, I do think that he's proved a lot this year. I think that if you're another team around the league, like if you're looking for a guy who's going to show heart and who's going to fill in a role, or at least like be total 100% insurance, like that's a guy you probably want to get. So I think from that perspective, he probably could be on an NBA roster next year. I don't know if it's going to be in Dallas, but I do expect him to be through the offseason, at least in a Dallas, uniform for a little bit, at least probably
yeah,
until the end of
I
summer.
think the main point that we're getting at is that he may have not proved so much this year that he's ready for a multi-year deal or a guaranteed contract or anything like that, but he definitely proved that he warrants another opportunity. That he didn't. His time in Dallas was definitely not redundant. He tore it up with the Texas Legends, and he has earned himself another crack at the shell here, if you will, in terms of his standing in the NBA and his attempt to become a rotation player. So we'll see how that unfolds. But next up, we'll be getting into AJ Lawson.
All right, so getting back into this, we're going to cover AJ Lawson and his his season as a whole. So Will, you were tasked with the AJ Lawson stat. You've been big on him pretty much all season. You've been like the one outcrier for him to at least get a little bit of a bigger role.
No, I think really besides maybe Bibbs Corner on Twitter, because he has been coveting AJ Lawson since his days at South Carolina. He's a big South Carolina Gamecocks fan, so I had to give my flowers to him. But aside from that, I guess since his time in Dallas, and yeah, maybe I've been the spearheader in the argument.
No, it's kind of funny, but I guess we're gonna start out with this. Like, what do you feel his biggest improvement was over the season? Because I mean, he did come into the season as a rookie. What do you feel like his biggest improvement was from the beginning of the season, at least to the end of the season?
I mean, even from if we're just talking about from his days in college, I think probably just his size and his strength that he was able to put on. He was able to serve as a little more of a stout defender than he was at North or South Carolina. He also just improved his three-pointer marginally. I think even from South Carolina days to when we got to the summer league and he started shooting like lights out versus the Bulls. And I mean, I think that sort of continued upon that upward trajectory. He didn't really get an opportunity at the NBA level to showcase that the three-pointer like a whole lot, only having played 15 games this year. But I think just becoming a more reliant, sort of 3-and-D player in multiple aspects, from him putting on some strength defensively, being able to bang up against some of these bigger guys, given he's already a pretty sort of quick-footed point of attack defender, at that 6'5", 6'6" frame. One of the just sort of knocks on his game is his inability to, just really be able to match guys size for size and use his length to deter things and, use his strength. That's something that he had to improve upon. He's not totally there yet in both of those aspects, as well as his shooting. But I think, a little more size added defensively, as well as maybe just more consistency shooting the ball, because when he does get hot, he can continue to just, throw flames as we saw last summer league. I think that could, serve as the biggest bridge to his improvement next year. But conversely, those were also probably what he improved upon the most last year. So just really continuing what he's doing is honestly going to be the best thing for his game, in my opinion, because, he's definitely not a guy that projects to be, to operate in a sort of ball handling capacity. He may, be a guy that's serviceable in the future, attacking off closeouts, and doing some different things there. Because we've seen with his time in the Texas Legends and some of the garbage time minutes with the Mavericks that he is not really as one-dimensional as some of the Mavericks other role players. But that being said, these are in spot up scenarios where he there's been an action that's ran and he's received the ball. He's not going to be a guy that's ever facilitating that action or leading the charge as the point of attack ball handler. But can he be a guy that is able to sort of just operate around the edges and not be as one-dimensional as some of the other Mavericks 3 and D role players going forward? I think that if he continues along his current trajectory, then I would say a definite yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to agree there. Like, I think in the beginning of the season, or okay, I'll go back to summer league. Like, we definitely saw, his versatility on the offensive thing, in the offensive end, because again, he was such a highlight shooter. He could get hot from deep and pretty much make everything in sight. That was pretty much summer league as a whole for him. I think at the beginning of the season, he was a little more one-dimensional. I think he, wanted to
The
fill in a
NBA
role.
level, I think, definitely caught up to him to an
Yeah,
extent.
yeah. Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think he wanted to fill in a role that the Mavericks needed, and it was sort of that 3-and-D kind of wing, catch and shoot guy. Definitely as the season progressed, I feel like we saw more of his true basketball sense where, he can create off the dribble. And he's honestly a really active on ball sort of guy. Whether it's getting rebounds on the glass or, just defensively, I think he with his length on the with his wingspan and everything, like he can get his hands pretty much anywhere and grab a steal or anything. Like he's a really good defensive minded guy in that sense. And even, on the glass, as I said, his ability to, hawk down balls and get them. And, he had honestly, one of the better guys, probably just getting some putback dunks on this Mavericks roster, which says a lot. But yeah, I mean, he uses that size and ability to get inside, and honestly, he's very rarely picked up on a box out. So I think that surprised me a little bit, and especially as the season progressed, just because, again, I think it was a little more one-dimensional at the beginning of the season, and then definitely kind of figured out some things as the NBA season progressed along. What do you think is the, I guess, biggest improvement that he needs to make next year? Like, do you feel like, or I guess, like, do you think he's, good enough to get on an NBA roster as is, or like what kind of progressions, what kind of improvements does he need to make to either be in a Mavericks uniform or, in another team's uniform, at least in the NBA, by next season?
I mean, just, back to what I said regarding, just continually, optimizing his defense, becoming a little more stout on that end to guard up a little bit. I mean, he's probably not going to be a guy that's going to ever, have the wherewithal to go and guard 4s and 5s, but if he could guard, 1 through 3 fairly consistently and, still use his foot speed to guard smaller guards, then I think that that's going to be a huge drawing point, as well as just consistency from that 3-point line, continually crashing the glass, being able to attack off a closeout and hit a mid-range jump shot, be a guy that can run out in transition. I think if he can just continue to do these things and just improve around the margins within them, that's going to be his best bet in terms of staying on the Mavericks or on an NBA roster in general. But I would be remiss to say that I don't fancy this guy, quote unquote. He's definitely a guy that I think has the sort of savviness and the potential to fill in around those margins, as I just alluded to. And I there's just I don't know, something about his personality, his drive, his work ethic. It kind of just rubs me the sort of way that he's going to be able to be a guy that can do that. But, obviously that's going to be something that we'll have to see. I assume he's, the Mavericks obviously let him sort of fall by the wayside after summer league en route to signing Tyler Dorsey. But, after Dorsey was waived and AJ Lawson's, two-way contract with the Timberwolves or whatever. I don't know if he was waived or whatever. I think that was the instance. The Mavericks were able to pick him up. And I'd hope that they don't make the same mistake twice and they bring him back at least for the summer league to see how he fares and then, make a decision upon his future accordingly. So I think that's, sort of the progression of events that we'll see kind of play out in the coming months, but definitely a guy that I could covet as being, I think even more so than McKinley Wright, a guy that we talked about earlier in this podcast, definitely has the potential to actually eclipse certain people within this Mavericks rotation and actually be, in those in really the top 8 or 9 people in a playoff rotation if everything were to go right. And it's a long shot to say everything will go right. I understand that, but he's a guy that he's one of those rare dudes at that two-way spot that I personally kind of covet and think that if everything were to go right, he could honestly be within the Mavericks rotation consistently.
Yeah, I think, we share the same sentiment there. I think that his intangibles make him a good basketball player. I think, his height, what kind of role he has, and, he's not too one-dimensional in that sense. I think that those, definitely provide good intangibles for him to have a fulfilling NBA career. I do think that he's probably more of an NBA player than McKinley Wright is. I know that McKinley Wright definitely had more of a role to fill on this Mavericks, or at least throughout this Mavericks season. But I think that AJ Lawson's he's just more of a basketball player. I think especially a modern day basketball player, filling in that frame and just sort of what he can bring on the court, I think is, one other than none. I think there's only a handful of guys in the league that can really do it at an elite level. And, assuming, as you said, assuming everything goes right, and, it's hard to predict, but assuming everything does go right, I think that he can be one of those guys that fills in a nice, bench role off the bench, or a nice bench role in a playoff series. So I would say that we tend to agree with that. Real quick, I don't know if you want to get into the sustainability or the surprising stat. I guess we'll go with the surprising stat real quick.
Okay.
What was your biggest surprising stat?
So throughout players in the NBA, this is per second spectrum on NBA.com, that played 10 games or more. That was the sort of litmus test that I used for the qualifier for this, because I felt like under 10 games was sort of redundant, but a lot of these guys didn't even play like 50 plus games. There's only 2 guys within this top 4 that did. So, take that with what you will, with sort of grain of salt, but every guy in this top 4 played 15 games or more at least. And within those, guys that played at least 10 games, like I said, their average foot speed on defense, in terms of, the whole NBA, AJ Lawson was ranked 4th per second spectrum, clocking in at around, I don't know if they're measuring it in miles per hour. So don't knock me if this is a fallacy or for whatever reason, but he clocked in at 4.3, what I presume is miles per hour. The only people in the NBA that had a higher average foot speed on defense that played at least 10 games or more were John Conchar, fellow Maverick Josh Green, and Gary Payton II. And, if you knew anything about Gary Payton II, he's kind of been riddled with injuries all year, but in the 22 games he's played, still probably one of the best point of attack defenders in basketball. And in regards to Josh Green, we've always said that, if he can just harness, this isn't a Josh Green player profile, but when we do get to him, we'll talk a lot about him just sort of harnessing some of that over fouling and that just sort of, controlling a little bit of the exuberance that he sort of exerts on defense. If he can just do that a little bit better and not maybe go through, sort of steal hunt or block hunt a little bit more and just stay in front of his man a little bit better, he'll be insanely good. And for 2 Mavericks to be in the top 5, it is pretty impressive from that perspective, even though it is kind of a one-off sort of stat, and it's definitely not a tell-all by any means. But I did find that fairly interesting, given that, these are more point of attack style defenders versus, just like strict 3-and-D wings that, you kind of would go, stick on, maybe a guy sort of operating from the wing, like a KD or something like that. Like, these are going to be guys trying to guard the opposing team's, usual best point guard. So from that perspective, for Mavericks fans that did not get to see too much of AJ Lawson this year, that thought he was sort of this listening to this podcast and, think he's kind of unfamiliar, didn't really watch the garbage time minutes. I would definitely say he's comparable to Josh Green in a lot of different aspects of their game, maybe except, on offense. I would say AJ Lawson's probably going to be a little bit more poised of a shooter potentially going forward. And, conversely, Josh Green's probably going to be a little bit more poised in terms of his dribble drive game, his ability to, play make after, attacking off a closeout, just do some other different, sort of dynamic things with the ball in offense. But AJ Lawson's going to be probably some very similar rendition of Josh Green as a player defensively, and then offensively, just, a little less of that offensive pop, but probably a little bit more shooting. So for those of you guys that are unfamiliar, but that was my surprising stat.
Yeah, again, he definitely had a better surprising stat than me, but you know what? We're going forward now. So
Yeah.
I guess, what are you most looking forward to this guy? I think I would confidently say I expect him to be in the Mavericks Summer League uniform. So I guess, what are you most looking forward to him in his time, in Vegas? And I mean, do you expect him to be in a Mavericks uniform next year?
If I had to guess, I would say yes. But that's the optimistic side of me. And, the Mavericks tend to, just shine quite a dim light at the optimistic side of me time after time, every free agency period. So I think we'll just have to see from that perspective. But I definitely think if I had to guess that he would be in a Mavericks uniform. And I do expect a, fairly strong summer league from him. Anytime that, I know the Mavericks had a just absolutely heinous summer league last year, but I think they'll probably have 3 returners this year. And anytime you build a little bit of continuity, having those guys play in the G League, and especially a guy in Jaden Hardy who's progressed so much from last year to this year. If you want to listen to that season review podcast, you can go listen to our previous podcast. It's up right before this. But anyways, given that there'll probably be 3 returners, McKinley, Wright, AJ Lawson, as well as Jaden Hardy, they all seem pretty cool with each other. If you've ever looked at their Instagram or anything like that, they play together in the G League. They're, all younger guys, pretty tight knit. I do expect the Mavericks to have just a strong showing summer league overall, if all 3 of those guys are back, but we'll just have to see how that plays out. Like I said, that's the optimistic side of me, and it always doesn't always pan out with Mr. Mark Cuban at the helm. So
So I would. Yeah, I think we're, pretty much just looking forward to.
You want me to answer the sustainability question out of 10?
Yeah, real quick. We'll get into sustainability. Out of 10, how sustainable do you think he is? And, can he, or I guess you already answered that, but how sustainable?
As optimistic as I am, I do have to sort of hold back some of my overexcitedness because this is a two-way guy at the end of the day. Like, I can be as optimistic as I want to be from that perspective, but, I do have to sort of place a governor on my expectations. That's a throwback to Coyote Ridge Golf Course right there, for those of you guys that don't know. But anyways, basically, I would probably say that AJ Lawson is maybe a 5 or a 6 out of 10 in terms of his sustainability with the Mavericks, because, like I said, I do think he has a more NBA applicable skill set than McKinley Wright. So it's going to be a little bit easier for him to, sort of seep through the cracks and earn that contract with the Mavericks. But, conversely, these guys, in that 2-way area can easily be, just cast aside and, opted for another guy. We've seen it last year with Tyler Dorsey. If AJ Lawson even has a little bit of a dry spell or, just a couple week span where, he just didn't look good at summer league, there's definitely a opportunity awaiting from another guy from another team that performed well at summer league that the Mavericks could take a chance at and invite into training camp. And AJ Lawson, is either, playing with another NBA team or overseas. But I'm pretty optimistic about this guy. But, there's a lot of volatility when we're talking about 2-way guys, so you can never be too sure.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, he is a 2-way guy, so you never really can be. We'll go with a nice 5.5. 5.5.
Okay, yeah, 5.5.
Sustainability rate.
Yeah, I think that's a good halfway marker.
Yeah, which, I feel like for a two-way guy, in a sample size of only 15 games, I think that's honestly pretty high, but like in a good way high, because again, I think he does have good intangibles that could, progress him and his NBA career to be a little longer than just a year. And I think that alone probably gets him another contract somewhere, assuming he has a good offseason. So, or hopefully in Dallas. But yeah, I think probably a 5.5 honestly sounds pretty good to me. So I would agree.
Yeah, I think that sort of wraps it up for the two-way guys. A bit of a more short, sweet and concise podcast, but I didn't want to, beat a dead horse too much on them because a lot of it's just going to be left up to how they fare this summer.
Yeah.
And I was going to say chance, but it's obviously conducive to how they play. So maybe from us just watching, it's just left up to chance, but not for them, not for them in their personal lives where, this is basically make or break for their NBA careers. So we will be locked in this summer. Me and Jaren have interests of covering the summer league, but we'll see if those come into fruition or not. But you could be here in 2 or 3 months or so with AJ Lawson or McKinley Wright the fourth, giving
Interviews.
Yes, well, doing the new intro to this pod.
Yeah.
This is McKinley Wright the fourth, and you're listening to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. So that's hopefully that comes into fruition. But otherwise, we will be back later tonight doing more player profiles. Kind of unsure who we're gonna do. We might throw all the washed veterans into the laundromat on this one. We might go Davis Bertans, Dwight Powell, the Markieff Morris trifecta, but we're still debating that. That would be quite the time. So we're getting through the back half of the roster at the moment, so bear with us. But we wanted to start out with a bang with Jaden Hardy, and then we'll get more towards the front half of the roster. So these will ramp up in terms of their excitedness. It's kind of how we wanted to do this. So you guys, for the few of you guys that do listen to the really bad ones, you'll be captivated by the time we get to the end. So barring that, you guys can follow us on all our socials on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. If you guys are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast platform, make sure to subscribe or follow us and give us a 5-star rating and review. We'd really appreciate it. Whatever floats your boat in terms of those reviews that you like about our show is by all means applicable. We are open to constructive criticism. Other than that, if you're listening on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and comment down below. Let's see, who is a better defensive player between AJ Lawson and McKinley Wright? Sometimes I try to make these more lighthearted, but I don't know. Today I was feeling serious. So besides that, we will catch you guys in the next one. Follow us on Twitter and all the socials, like I said. Mainstream Mavs signing out.
Bye-bye.